The Giants made the postseason for the first time in 6 long years, and they have Brian Daboll to thank for that. Not just because his schemes and play calling have done well to showcase Saquon Barkley and remind everyone what he's capable of, but also because he's done a fantastic job at trying to get the very best that he possibly could out of Daniel Jones. Big Blue doesn't have an overwhelmingly good offense, but they are good enough. Before Week 18 kicked off, when they rested their starters, they were ranked 15th in the league in points per game at nearly 22. They were 10th in the all-important EPA per play metric, and they had one of the most explosive rushing attacks in the entire league with 70 total explosive runs on the season, and that was 5th most in the NFL, by the way. The fact that the Giants have played at this level, considering their revolving door at receiver and offensive line this year, and considering that they were in such bad shape cap-wise over the summer that they had to let James Bradberry go for literally nothing because they couldn't afford him, it's just, to me, one of the most remarkable turnarounds and coaching jobs that I have ever seen. And so all of that then begs the question, how exactly did Brian Daboll do this? From an X's and O's perspective, what is the special sauce here that has somehow elevated an objectively very undermanned roster straight into the playoffs? Well, there's two things that we need to go over in order to answer that. Number one, the structure of their run game, which is incredibly explosive and one of the best in the league. And number two, the structure of their passing game, which is functional. Mostly. We'll go over that nuanced discussion of Daniel Jones and his future much later in the episode, believe you me. But I kind of want to start with all the fun stuff first and everything that I genuinely love watching about this Giants team because they just kind of refuse to die. And one of the main reasons why they're so hard to beat in the first place and why they actually have a chance of maybe going on a little run here is because at the end of the day, they have Saquon Barkley and this run game. Obviously, the Giants' rushing attack is really, really good, but what I find truly fascinating are all of the ways in which they find success. When we think of a good run game, we usually think of teams like the 49ers or the Ravens that come out in these big, heavy personnel groupings and they'll mash it down people's throats. But the Giants actually run the ball more often and are more effective at running it from 11 personnel, meaning 1 back, 1 tight end, and 3 receivers on the field. They are the number 1 team in the entire league in terms of EPA per play on 11 personnel runs. They are 5th in the percentage of runs that result in a first down or a touchdown at 30.5%, and they're 5th in explosive runs from that personnel grouping at 41. Plus, they have the second lowest stuff rate, meaning taking a tackle for loss or no gain, at just 5.6% of their attempts. For reference, the Dolphins, who really struggle to run the ball from 11 personnel, take a tackle for loss or no gain at a whopping 14% of their runs. So it's a massive, massive difference in efficiency. Now, hearing all those numbers, you might be wondering why the Giants are so much better at running from lighter personnel than everyone else, especially since, by its very nature, 11 personnel is a pass-oriented grouping. And at least to me, their success is largely because of how they use pass-heavy personnel to force defenses into certain types of fronts. If you roll out 12, 13, or even 21 or 22 personnel on offense, which are more run-oriented groupings, then it's much more likely that the defense will respond with a base package of their own, which of course then increases the likelihood that at least up front on the defensive line, there will be one extra body to play the types of fronts that give the Giants trouble. Those fronts in particular that New York struggles against for the most part are things like odd fronts, tight fronts, or something like an Okie front or an under front from a 5-2 structure, as Wade Phillips calls it, with 5 bodies on the line of scrimmage and 2 linebackers behind them. Those types of defensive structures, with all that mass to work through on the line of scrimmage, tends to create a lot more one-on-ones with the offensive line, which is not good for the Giants because when it comes to winning on the types of zone runs that they rely on, they don't do too well one-on-one. They need double teams, but they can't get those doubles when pre-snap everyone is covered up by a big body. Some offenses are good at running inside zone or duo or some outside zone with bigs on bigs because their O-line can actually win one-on-one, like the Patriots for instance, who average 4.6 yards per attempt on it, but the Giants do not. They average 2 yards per attempt, which is obviously pretty abysmal. They need a lighter box to help out their offensive line and give them more opportunities and time to work those double teams, And even more importantly than that, they also need a lighter box so that it frees up numbers for them to do the two things that they actually are really good at, which is pulling blockers and creating angles. The Giants' run game is not very similar to, say, the 49ers' run game in terms of just pure scheme, but it is very similar philosophically in that Brian Daboll, just like Kyle Shanahan, is ridiculously good at putting his offensive linemen into the best situation possible when it comes to angles and space. I'll use this play as an example from early in the second quarter of the Colts game a couple weeks ago, and keep in mind that the Giants had not scored yet in this game up to this point. So this play, in my opinion, is really what jump-started them out to that 38-10 blowout that we saw over the next couple of quarters. New York is in 11 personnel, obviously, and again, they did that just to force Indy into a lighter nickel package with only 4 down linemen and 2 linebackers. And if you look at the end zone angle, because of this dirty bunch to the field side, and the Colts only having 4 down linemen up front, you can see just how much room is naturally created in the weak side B-gap bubble. This bubble is what the Giants want to attack, and they're only able to attack it because of how light the box is. Now, after the motion of Daniel Bellinger into the backfield to play a quasi-fullback type role, you can see that the actual concept that the Giants are running here has its DNA rooted in a traditional power lead run call out of a 2-back look, just like you would see in, say, San Francisco. But what Brian Daboll has done to expand on that is allowed his players to make key adjustments if they need to in order to make their own assignments easier to execute. And the results of those adjustments is a play that looks sort of similar to power, but also kind of not. I will elaborate on those adjustments, by the way, but before I do that, you first need to understand a couple of other concepts or you're going to have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about, so just trust me, this tangent is for your own good. First things first, the Colts are in a flex front, that's important for you to know, and that's kind of like an over front, but also not really. The 3-technique defensive tackle is set to the strong side of the offensive formation, just like an over front, but the nose on the backside is in a 2-eye alignment instead of a traditional shade technique on the center. That's kind of the main difference between a flex front and an over front, is just where the nose tackle is set. Once again, this alignment means that the bubble in the defensive front is going to be on the weak side of the offensive formation, all the way in the weak side B gap. Now, if you're going to pull a guard and run power into this front to the weak side, it's actually a lot harder to do than you would think, because if this guard is pulling, that means the center has to execute a back block to seal out that 3 technique from getting a pretty much free tackle for loss. And that is a long way to go to get your hands on a guy as talented as DeForest Buckner. A center back blocking any 3 technique is the hardest block to make in probably any run scheme. If you were going to ask offensive line coaches, they would mostly agree with that. There's very few centers that can actually do it. And on top of that, there's also a lot of ways to make it even harder on the center to execute an already really difficult block. So most teams just don't even call power runs unless they're running it at the 3 technique instead of away from him. I think back to the 2019 season, early in the year when the Raiders were still in Oakland back then, and to this day, this is one of my favorite examples of what happens when you try to call power going away from an elite defensive tackle. This is Chris Jones out here at the 3 technique spot, and the Raiders are calling power lead behind fullback Alec Ingold. Having the center try to back block Jones with that much space is already a sketchy assignment at best, but to make matters even worse, the Chiefs also creeped up the will linebacker into the A-gap on this 3rd and short situation just to make sure that Jones had a one-on-one. Now with a brand new threat in the A-gap and the guard pulling, which leaves an even bigger vacant space, all of a sudden the center has to try to handle both of these threats at once, and his only help for doing that is the left tackle, who's at a massive disadvantage in trying to keep Jones from knifing inside when he himself is also way wider than Jones is. The result, obviously, is that Jones steps into the vacant space created by the puller. Defensive line coaches call this chasing the pull, and he gets himself an easy tackle for loss to get the Raiders off the field. So hopefully with you understanding all of that newfound context while we go back to this Giants-Colts film, again, I know it's a lot to take in at once, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask down in the comments below. I am an open book on this. But hopefully, if you got all that the first try, you can see the dilemma created here by Indy's defense. There may still be a wide open B-gap bubble, but if this guard pulls and DeForest Buckner gets a good jump, then this play is probably dead in the water anyway because there's very few centers that can get out to him and close that space in time. This is a really hard scheme to make work to the weak side. So what is Brian Daboll to do? If he really wants to run anything like power to the weak side with a pulling blocker away from the 3 technique, how does he adjust all of these assignments to make it successful? Well, once more, the solution is a lot simpler than you think because it's all about angles and timing. This is what some coaches call a cage tag, meaning center and guard. So instead of pulling the backside guard on a normal power lead scheme, instead Daboll lets his players adjust into a power cut scheme where the center is the puller, not the guard. With that small adjustment in assignment, Daboll creates a frontside pin here on the nose tackle with that playside guard, who's the guard that's referenced in the cage terminology, and that then lets the center fold around to provide the extra blocker to the front side in the hole, which is exactly the same thing that you would see on a normal power run. The left tackle is also widening out the edge, like normal. You have the crack coming down on the safety from the single receiver on that side, and now you've got an alley created with that center lead blocking out in front and the right guard kicking ass out in space. Also, by the way, side note, you may be wondering, hold up, how the hell did that backside guard get there when I thought he wasn't going to be pulled? And you're right, he wasn't. If you go back to the start of the play, you can see another slight adjustment that they made here to get that guard out in front. This is the cut part of a power cut scheme, which some coaches also refer to as split power because it's somewhat similar to split zone, I guess. I mean, not really, but coaching terminology, it depends on who you ask, and a lot of it just doesn't really make sense. So just think of it like split zone and power had a baby and you're pulling the center. I don't know, this shit's weird, just go with me on this. Anyway, rather than trying to back block from an awkward angle while also trying to get Bellinger to lead all the way around to the front side to pick off a linebacker who they hope will flow exactly to the right spot at exactly the right time, Daboll just makes it easier on everyone and says, screw it, we're going to release the right guard immediately, get him up to the second level right away, that way he can get on the will, and then they can use Bellinger to just throw a cut block on Buckner and try to slow him down. They don't need him blocked, they just need him slowed down, and a cut block is a hell of a lot more reliable for that than a back block from a center would be. So taking this play in from start to finish, and hopefully you followed me the entire time on this. I apologize if it's been really confusing. I know this is pretty high level stuff. But if you followed me the entire time, you can see how we get an all-world caliber 3 technique stumbling on the ground, we get an all-world caliber nose tackle in Grover Stewart sealed out on the front side, we get a linebacker immediately engaged on the second level so he can't get downhill, the edge is widened, the safety is cracked, and at the end of the day, we're in business for a big gain. When you look at most of New York's explosive runs this season, the common theme is pretty easy to spot. Brian Daboll has allowed all of his players to have so many micro adjustments at their disposal based on the fronts and personnel in front of them that they can give themselves the best angles and the best matchups possible to execute their blocks. He does not force them into just running it the way it's drawn up in the playbook. He gives them the freedom to problem solve within their system based on what they see, and it's remarkably effective. On an individual level, none of these Giants offensive linemen are amazing, other than probably Andrew Thomas, of course, but their line truly is greater than the sum of its parts because of how their run game is designed and coached. And when it comes down to it, their run game is why they made the playoffs. So to me, Brian Daboll deserves every ounce of credit for that success. But you know what? I also think that he deserves a lot of credit for the passing game as well, because they're decent-ish. And if you go back to the summer, I did a preview of every single team that was like an hour long with my podcast partner EJ over on the Bootleg Football Podcast channel. And, we were looking at the Giants roster and we were fully prepared for this team to be absolutely hideous on offense. And they weren't. By the grace of Brian Daboll, they were actually kind of okay. That being said, though, the one topic that I do want to hit on when discussing their pass game is Daniel Jones. I can't talk about how amazing Brian Daboll is and why I think he should be Coach of the Year, which he should, without at least dedicating a little bit of time of talking about the apparent improvement of Danny Dimes. And by that I mean, Brian Daboll has done so much heavy lifting this year, both as a play caller and play designer, that we are now tricking ourselves into looking at a passing offense that throws for like 185 yards a game and saying, you know what, it could have been a lot worse. Because truthfully, it could have been a lot worse. There's kind of a lot of nuance there when breaking down what Jones did this year, so I'm going to try to be as balanced and diplomatic as possible when talking about him, because objectively speaking, he did okay considering the circumstances. And I think that he did better than a lot of other quarterbacks would have done, or maybe not a lot, but at least several other quarterbacks would have done in similar circumstances. So by no means is he a bottom tier quarterback. But I also refuse to lie to you. Daniel Jones' arm was not a key factor in the Giants' success. His legs maybe, but definitely not his arm. Every single week, and I mean every week, there has been at least one or two plays where a Giants receiver is running wide ass open deep down the field and Jones does not pull the trigger. I don't want to hear any excuses about the quality of the receiving core. These are all NFL players. Every single one of these dudes was all conference in college, and they all had to be the best of the best on the planet to even get a roster spot in this league. So they can get open, and they do get open, but for whatever reason, Jones will not throw the ball deep down the field. There was one play in particular that really set me off. Ironically, it was in the last game that Jones played against the Vikings less than a month ago, where he had a sure touchdown that very possibly could have been the difference in the game, but he didn't throw it. If you watch my recent video on the structure of the Vikings defense and why they are, to put it politely, absolute garbage, then you already probably know a lot of what I'm about to say, but for those of you that have not seen that, here we see yet another example of the Vikings in a half-quarter-quarter scheme. They run that more than anybody else in the league by far. And the thing about half-quarter-quarter is that on the quarter side, if there's only one wide receiver, it basically just plays out like man coverage, but with a robber helping inside. That's pretty much what it is from a practical standpoint. And Brian Daboll knows that, so he dialed up a perfect play call to attempt to give Daniel Jones an easy shot down the sideline. This is like a delayed sluggo route, which is a double move off a fake slant, and the entire point of this route is to get Patrick Peterson to bite on the delayed break inside with a speed turn back over the top so that he loses vision on the route. By the time he comes back to find the slant, it will have already broken back downfield towards the sideline, and since the safety was in quarters and not playing a deep half, there's nobody deep down the boundary at all to help out. Jones is not under pressure. He knows what the play call is, so he should know that if Darius Slayton wins on the route against this particular coverage, it should be a touchdown. And he's even rolling out of the pocket in that direction, so his eyes should be downfield on that side, but he just doesn't throw it. Instead, he takes off and runs and gets 10 yards and a first down, and sure, that's all well and good, except that 10-yard run is worth nothing compared to a 49-yard touchdown. Oh, and by the way, the Giants fumbled on the very next play, and the Vikings went right back down the field and got a field goal off that turnover to make it 10-0. So that's literally a 10-point swing, going from a potential game-tying touchdown to a 10-point hole, all with one missed opportunity. And I truly wish that it was just that game that those missed opportunities like that happened, but it was every game. Every single week, Jones would work the quick passing game, and he would make plays on scrambles, and Daboll would dial up a bunch of RPOs to try to make things as easy and as efficient as possible. And whenever they got into the red zone, they were actually pretty good at converting those opportunities into touchdowns, but Jones almost never pushed the ball down the field to make it easier to get to the red zone in the first place. To put the problem into context, they were 7th in scoring efficiency from inside the opponent's 20-yard line, but 20th in terms of the number of drives that actually got that far down the field, all because they were so reluctant or just straight up bad at generating explosive pass plays. New York is 7th in RPOs called, they are 3rd in play action, and they've run the most bootlegs out of anyone in the NFL. But interestingly enough, on those bootlegs in particular, Jones also had the 36th ranked average depth of target in the league among all quarterbacks at just 3.3 yards. That means that he's lower than several backups at this point. Almost every single boot that they called the entire season, he threw it to the flat, and then to the flat again, and again, and again, and again, and if he didn't just dump it off underneath, he would keep it and try to get some yards with his legs. Calling a bootleg for them was not to push the ball down the field like most other teams, it was basically just treated as an extension of the run game. This system has been designed from the ground up to hold Daniel Jones' hand and to make him not have to do any of the heavy lifting. And you know what? It's worked. They're in the playoffs, and they very well could win a playoff game. But how much longer will this work? How much longer is making the playoffs going to be enough? I'm not trying to rain on Giants fans' parade here because I know that success is a very welcome change after the last decade, and Brian Daboll is phenomenal, and they're a good team, and he should be the coach of the year. Like, it's an easy decision to me. He is the coach of the year, and he is amazing. I do not disagree with that at all. I just think that going into this offseason, regardless of what happens the rest of the playoffs, if they're investing all this money in a receiving core, or they're making a trade, or they go after DeAndre Hopkins, or they invest in the offensive line, or they draft some good rookies, I genuinely hope that happens. But what is that going to matter if Daniel Jones isn't pulling the trigger anyway? If we're looking at a top 10 receiver running wide open deep down the field and a bottom 10 receiver running wide open deep down the field, guess what? They both get 0 yards if the quarterback doesn't pull the trigger. That's the problem here. It's not that Daniel Jones is horrible, it's that Daniel Jones should be a lot better, and I wish he would take that next step. I really do. I'm not a hater on Daniel Jones. I'm not somebody who wants him to fail. Like, I would love to be wrong. I would love to have egg on my face just like I did about Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes, because I want the Giants to be good. But fuck, this team is frustrating to watch when you have Darius Slayton running like 10 yards of space down the field and the game is winnable and the ball isn't thrown. It is fucking frustrating. The end goal is winning a ring, not just making the playoffs. And eventually I do think that Brian Daboll will win a ring for the Giants. I think he is one of these rare types of head coaches that can completely turn around a franchise. I think he is that good. But will he win that ring with Daniel Jones as his quarterback going up against all the other mutants in the NFL, both in the NFC and especially in the AFC? Will he be able to pull that off with Daniel Jones once you actually have to pay Daniel Jones a lot of money? That's the part I have my doubts on. I really hope that he makes me wrong. I'm being 100% truthful about that. I want Daniel Jones to be good. I want the Giants to be good. They have had a rough decade, and they deserve to have at least a little bit of happiness, right? But I mean, I built my whole brand and my whole channel on being truthful. Even if I'm wrong sometimes, I'm not gonna lie to you. So I'm just gonna be honest and let the chips fall where they may. Now, that all being said, if you did watch all of this episode and you're still here, even if you're a Giants fan and you're just fuming mad, and you watched all of this and you watched the Giants, or not the Giants, the Vikings defense episode that I put out recently, talking about how they are, to be politically correct, hot garbage, both schematically and in terms of execution. It's a horror show over there. So if you're a Giants fan and you want to feel better, go watch that episode. But if you watched them both already, you are now in a unique position where you have a lot of random knowledge about both the Giants offense and the Vikings defense at the same time. And if you want to weaponize that information to try to make some money on this game, I think that you are in a very favorable position to do so. So on the screen right now is my Underdog Pick'em entry for this game. Again, you take 5 players and you're going higher or lower on all of their totals. It pays out 20 to 1 if you hit all 5, but you can also do insurance where you only have to hit 4 out of 5, and that still pays 10 to 1. This is a $50 entry that I did, so if I hit all 5, I make $1,000. Again, if you did insurance, you could only hit 4 out of 5 and still, get paid out 10 to 1. So you'd still win $500 as long as you just hit 4. I took the higher on Daniel Jones rushing attempts. I took higher on Daniel Bellinger receiving yards and Richie James receiving yards, because I think that James has become a really nice part of this offense as of late. And Bellinger, I think, is going to be a really underrated piece for this team going forward as well. And on top of that, I also took lower on Kirk Cousins fantasy points and the over on Greg Joseph's field goals. So I guess you can kind of put 2 and 2 together on who I think is going to win this game if I were to make a pick. I'm slightly favoring Big Blue here. Again, thank you to Underdog for partnering with me this season. If you guys want to tail this entry and try to make some money on your own, or if you think that I'm a complete moron and you want to go against it, either way, you can build your own slip at the link in the description below. And also, if you're a first-time depositor, if you've never played Underdog before, you can get a $100 deposit match up to that first $100 if you use that link in the description below. So you get $100 free to use on the platform. not just for this game, but especially for next weekend too. If you're a new player and you're using my link, you get a free space for the divisional round. All Film Room audience members that are new to Underdog that are using this promo, you get a basically free space. It's over Patrick Mahomes' 0.5 completion, so it's essentially guaranteed. You get that for the divisional round, so you can kind of basically just only have to hit 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 5, depending on if you're doing insurance. It just kind of ups your odds of getting that payout. So again, you get 100 free bucks and basically a free space for the divisional round. Thank you to Underdog for sponsoring. Thank you guys for sticking with me this late in the episode. We have something slightly different coming next week, but I think if you're a Bears fan, you're going to be very excited for it. And hope to see you all very, very soon. Cheers.